Welcome to the Black Paper. My name is Ndukwe and Cheta.
My name is Cheta.
How's it been, Cheta? Been a busy week?
You don't want to. You don't want to know. Yes, it has been busy.
Yeah.
It has been very busy. I've enjoyed it. I've not enjoyed it because I've talked too much this week. But
well, let's get you talking some more.
Yeah.
And today, talking specifically about Israel-Iran, their war, and how it affects, if it does affect in any way, African migrants here in the UK, or as Cheta would like to call us, expats.
Well, short answer, yes, it will have an effect. Can we go home now?
It was quite interesting. I saw on TikTok some days ago videos of people saying, look, man, Iran, this thing does not concern us. Just look at us. And they were pointing to their skin saying, look, these guys, it's not us. Your problem is with US, is with those guys who think they want to show power. But watching it, I was just laughing because there's no such thing as an isolationist world or as an isolated world, no matter how Trump or JD Vance would like to keep or would like to carry on the rhetoric about staying out of other people's issues, because even just now, there's still that news of them weighing up how much they get involved, not even if they get involved, but just how much they get involved in the Israel-Iran conflict. However, today, let's focus on this conflict and just what it means for that person living somewhere in the UK, naive enough to think that, this is none of my business.
Well, I would like to correct something that you said because it's not entirely accurate. There is a world where America specifically can be isolationist. Now, whether that fits into the world that has been constructed since 1945, that's another question entirely. America can, in many respects, totally, in quotes, be isolationist.
I'd like to hear this.
And they will be fine. So, okay, I'm a geopolitical scientist. That's why I'm a geopolitical analyst. That's what I do for a living. So we study these things. We study the impact of conflicts such as this, how it relates. Now, the United States has unique geopolitical advantage over other great powers. They're protected by two oceans from the rest of the world: the Pacific to their west and the Atlantic to their east. They are also in a position where they don't have any other great power in their own hemisphere. So Canada, which is to their north, is essentially a very small country, even though it has very large territory. Something of the order of 80% of Canada's population lives within 40 or 100 kilometers of the US border, because Canada has not been able to, and this brings us into what we call geographical determinism, which so in geopolitics, I think there are two broad schools. There's the realist school and there's the idealist school. I subscribe to the realist school, and one of the subsets of the realist school is geographical determinism, where you look at features of geography and you come to the conclusion that a state will behave in a certain way because of its geography. It's one of the reasons why, as you know, I don't support Biafra when we talk about back home. That's the Igbo separatist movement, because our geography as Igbo people means that Biafra is unlikely to work. But that's another, let's not go into that. So basically, the US could be isolationist because the Eurasian African landmass, which is where the bulk of geopolitics happens, can go to a mess, as it were, and the US will not really be touched. It's bounded east and west by oceans, and it's in a continent, the American landmass, North and South America, where it doesn't have any rivals. There's nobody. I mean, the closest country in that entire landmass that could come close to being a great power is Brazil. But even Brazil has huge problems that will take it a long time to overcome before it starts getting on the ladder of being a great power. So in that respect, yes, there is a case that can be made. Having said that, because of the global nature of US power, especially US business, what happens in the rest of the world concerns them. The US Navy is essentially the organization that keeps the world's sea lanes free for commerce and trade, and because in the last 30 years the US has moved to being a post-industrial power. If the Chinese, for example, as we've seen with the recent trade war, if the Chinese stop manufacturing or are unable to get products out, Americans will feel it. But that brings us to that thing
Yeah,
of
but Cheta, you
short
see,
and long term.
yeah, but you see, what you've just described now envisions a world where there's almost no information about what goes on in the other world, outside world, and where there are no
I would
internal,
say
no,
not
hang on,
information, interaction.
yeah, interaction, and where there are no sub communities within the US. So now, if the US was a world to be able to stand alone without any form of influence or interaction with the outside world, then the US would almost have to be like either in North Korea or an East Germany, which again, well, if you ask Trump, that works for him.
I think you're taking my argument to too much of the extreme. The
Yeah,
overall point, the
but
overall
we have to look at it. But because the question was, it was around the idea of the U.S. or any country being able to pursue an isolationist policy.
And what I was answering is yes, they can.
Mm.
By the time they can, now the question is, will they or can
Will
they
they?
afford to based on the current world?
Even when you
Which
say
is a
they can,
different
is
question.
to what extent can they? Because when you look at people, let's say take
And I think
apartheid, for instance, in South
in
Africa,
South Africa, yeah,
and the ripple effect it had in the US. Take,
It
but the
didn't
other
have-
way around.
apartheid did not have that much of a ripple effect in the
But there were
US.
protests.
There were protests, limited protests.
Yeah, but
Yes. Now,
but
think of
the
think
US
of
was
the
not
US
as
think of
isolated
the US
in a way.
before World War One and before World War Two, where they were standoffish. They didn't intervene. After World War One, they withdrew from Europe once again. Basically, what I'm saying is whether they will is another matter. But the point I'm making is that they can. Now, are they willing to endure the pain that would them in terms of transitioning from the world that we know it, which they constructed, to a more isolationist world, a less interdependent world? That's another question entirely.
Look at
Because
the
if
failures of Trump's tariffs.
which is the point.
They can't
So,
even afford to.
one of the things, and I'm saying that if they are willing to, so it's a question of their pain threshold. If they are willing to have to undergo the kind of pain that some other societies can put up with, then they will absolutely detach from the rest of us. And that's the point. The point is based on geography and based on real politics. They can. I didn't say that they will. I said that they can. There's a difference. Now,
Yeah, I know,
compared to
but that's
those
almost
citi-
like
it's again back. So for example, for you in the UK as an example, one of the reasons why historically the UK has never really was able to do Brexit, so has never really been into Europe, and took a long time to get into the EU, and then got out the moment they felt like, was because the UK is an island. It's a bit detached from what happens in the main Eurasian landmass. But for Germany, for example, what is happening in Israel-Iran is going to have a more direct effect because they are connected by land directly. You can walk from Berlin to Tehran. You can walk from Berlin to Tel Aviv. You can't walk from London to Tehran, and you definitely cannot walk from Washington to Tehran. And that's the point.
let's leave that US politics at the US border, and let's come back to the UK, where the question really is how, or if possible, the conflict between Israel and Iran will have any bearing on what happens here. Now, the thing is, and interestingly, the US and Iran weren't always at each other's throats. In the 60s and 70s, Israel and Iran then was under the Shahs, were allies, cooperating on intelligence, military tech, and oil. But again, then came the Iranian Revolution, in which the Ayatollahs took over, and in support of their brothers around Israel, decided that Israel had to go down. And this new regime started calling for the overthrow or the cessation of the existence of Israel. And they then went further, funding groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas, Gaza, and this, well, if you believe in the ideology of an eye for an eye, this has started this endless eye poking, as it were. And now today we're in a situation where they're firing rockets at each other?
Well, I think it's important to, because these things don't just happen in isolation. So I think it's important, before I begin, I think it's important for me to first caveat that it is true that the regime in Tehran, the Ayatollahs, are a nasty piece of work. But these guys didn't just arrive on the scene in isolation. Something led to their emergence. So we have to go slightly further back. And when I say slightly further back, I'm talking of to the start of the 20th century. That's the end of the great game between the UK and Russia, the British Empire and the Russian Empire. Both of them were very active in Iran. Eventually, in 1925, the British backed a guy called Mohammad Reza to become the Shah of Iran. Now, Mohammad Reza did not quite. He wanted to be neutral during the Second World War, so both Britain and the Soviet Union invaded Iran during the war to get, especially because of the oil supplies. Now, after the war ended, Iran became a constitutional monarchy. In 1951, I think, a guy called Mohammad Mossadegh was elected to be prime minister. Mossadegh nationalized Iranian oil in 1953. And when he nationalized the Iranian oil, the British were not happy about it. But by this time, Britain was no longer a strong empire, so they needed help. So they reached out to the Americans and they organized a coup that removed Mossadegh and replaced him with the Shah, Mohammad Reza's son. That's Shah Pahlavi.
Who was not up, and again, it's one of those things.
Who was a dictator. He was brutal. He had this secret police called the Savak. They used to disappear people. So 26 years later, you had 26 years of resistance, people coalescing. So you had this unlikely alliance between the middle class, the liberal middle class, the communists, the religious establishment, which is the Ayatollahs. They all came together and overthrew the Shah by 1979. And this goes back to something that I tell Nigerians a lot when you hear Nigerians expressing frustration about our rather incompetent government, saying we need a revolution. I'm always like, revolution is all well and good, but you have to ask the question, what happens the day after? After the revolution, and one thing that always happens in revolutions throughout history is the people who end up taking power are the people who are most organized. In 1979, the group that was most organized to seize power were the Ayatollahs. So when the Iranian Revolution happened, the head, Ayatollah Khomeini, who was in exile in Paris, was flown back in. And immediately, they came, the others said, oh yes, we all revolted together, we are all brothers. The Ayatollahs came in, took power, and immediately began to suppress all the other groups. They killed their leaders, all of that stuff. And then, now, one of the things that we must also look at is Iran is largely Shia Muslim. They've had this 1,000-year fight with the Sunnis. Many Sunni, some branches of Sunni Islam actually says that Shiites are not Muslim. It's one of the reasons why it was easy, in quotes, for the Shah to have a sort of alliance with Israel. Consider the world before 1979. Israel was always fighting with the Arab states. Always. They had 3 wars before 1979. But by 1979, by the time the Ayatollahs were coming into power in Iran, a lot of Sunni Arab countries were beginning to at least reach peace deals with Israel. Egypt had signed the Camp David agreement between Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. So Jordan had signed up for peace. So you see, these things have started happening. And then in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. Lebanon has a huge Shia population, which is where Hezbollah came from. And that Shia population reached out to their Shia brothers, the Ayatollahs in Iran. Now, from the Ayatollah's point of view, and it's the same kind of thing that Netanyahu is backing on now. When you create an external enemy, it has the effect of rallying your population around the flag. So from the point of view of the Ayatollahs, Hezbollah did not exist at the time. The Shiites in Lebanon reaching out for help created that external enemy to rally the flag around. And bear in mind that this was all happening in the context of the Iran-Iraq war, which was 2 years old at that time. So it gave the Iranians something to rally around. And I think, for the record, one of the things that, and this is why translation is very delicate work. When you hear Iranian crowds shouting death to America, they are doing it in their language. It's the same equivalent. They don't have a word for damn America. So basically, when they're saying death to America, it's kind of like saying damn America, damn or fuck America. That's pretty much what they're saying. But by the time you translate it to English, it comes out as death to America. And then Americans take it from that literal translation. So I think it's important to have these little nuances, little context there, so that people.
The world revolves around nuances, doesn't it? And when we take things...
sorry, Ndukwe, I think one of the problems that has happened to the world is so many people have lost the ability to seek and understand nuance. They just take things on the surface and react based on that.
Well, so it's not even so much as people having lost the ability to understand nuance as it is the world being engineered to ignore nuance. Because you just spoke about rallying round a flag. It's social engineering, isn't it?
Yes.
Let's take our grievances and point them at an enemy, and then suddenly all of us look around and forget our individual differences and say,
misdirection.
Yeah, it's misdirection. When you have, sadly, media landscape where things are either black or white, depending on which side of the political aisle you sit or which side of society you sit on, and you forget that in between there's that gray, and it's in the gray that the truth often lies. And so I think what's happened now is that we're creating a world where nuance be damned, facts be damned. It's whatever I see, it's whatever I feel. And coming back to that, we're not going to damn nuance or facts on this podcast. We're going to look at how, again, it's not just a black and white fight between Israel and Iran. Somehow, it has managed to create shadow conflicts in Africa, and in doing so, has opened up some sort of migration highway to Europe, to the UK, and to everywhere, so our streets, so that when the likes of reform and the far right are shouting, oh, there are too many people coming over the small boats.
But your neighbor is saying the same thing.
How many times is this now, Cheta? Every episode.
It's just my little way of holding you to account. You're in the government, so
no, definitely. Well, I'm in the local government. But anyway, when politicians then start shouting about the small boat crossings or the channel crossings, what most times you are not being told is that somehow either us or our allies are creating the situations, the conditions that make people's surroundings so hot that they seek to flee. And it's quite a very important line or set of dots that must be drawn. The countries that migrants have been fleeing to are not always not implicit in creating those conditions that make these people run. So, Cheta, do we want to talk about the shadow wars in Africa being fought by Israel and Iran, and also how that has helped bring a steady flow, if you may, of migrants to the UK, and what that means for those who are here? Or you know what we can do? Because I've just seen we've spent the first half laying the foundation for what I think should be a very interesting second half. So let's go for a quick break. Doesn't feel, I mean, the time has gone. It feels like we've just been here for 5 minutes. Yeah. So go for a quick break, and when we're back, Cheta will dig into today, having laid historical foundation.
That's fine. Very good.
Welcome back to the Black Paper. My name is Ndukwe
and I'm Cheta Wanze.
In the first half, me and Cheta first of all started from a theoretical argument of whether the US can or cannot, will or will not isolate itself. And then we moved into Iran and Israel conflict, where Cheta masterfully laid out the histories behind what we see today, and just how interest again by the Western powers in, let's say, in the politics of one country has then led years later to a region that's always at the throat of each other. So now, Cheta, how do we then go from the fall of the Shahs, the rise of the Ayatollahs, to shadow wars in Africa and disagreements on the streets of the UK?
Okay, thanks. Building up from that context, let's take Nigeria as an example. Probably up until today, there's a lot of Israeli training within our security services. So, for example, our secret police, the DSS, they are trained a lot by Israeli guys. Now this gives a target, as it were, for our own various local jihadi groups. And bear in mind that, for a start, the Islamic movement of Nigeria is backed and financed by Iran. To their credit, the Islamic movement of Nigeria has not come out in open insurrection. But there's also the thing of other jihadi groups, such as Boko Haram, such as Lakurewa, who will see this as a fight of the Ummah against an infidel. So it gives them something to rally around. This is how this so be the law of unintended consequences. So I think that the first problem that Western countries will face if the EU directly gets involved, and I think that at some point the US will directly get involved and start bombing Iran. If that happens, you create a huge refugee crisis. Syria was a country of 28 million people back in 2011 when it fell to pieces. Libya was a country of I think 14 million people or thereabouts when it fell to pieces. The refugee crisis that Syria specifically created in Europe is one that Europe has still not recovered from, and it led to the rise of far rights or far right politics. When you look at a map, Iran still has the geographic features that will cause this thing. There's a reason why Iran always tries to expand westward and not eastward. To Iran's east, Iran is bordered by Afghanistan, Pakistan, which in many respects are not exactly functioning states, but then it's also very mountainous. Whereas to its west, it's a lot of flat land or relatively flat land. So you are going to have, it will be like a funnel. If Iran falls to pieces, many of the refugees will flow west. And the first place that they will flow towards is Turkey. Now, Turkey took in the bulk of Syrian refugees, and they are sick of refugees. It's actually a major part of Turkish politics now. So what is likely to happen, especially given that Erdogan, Turkey's leader, is not very happy with the EU and all of that, what's likely to happen is that the Turks will simply move the refugees from Iran along. We are move it on. So those refugees will point to places like Greece, Bulgaria, and all of that. And from there, once they point to those countries, they're in the EU, which means that they can move on. And some of them will end up in the UK. Now, note, a lot of Iranians speak English. A lot of Iranians have families in exile in the UK. So it means that the UK is a natural place that they will want to head to, because of language, because of presence of a community. So that will end up creating a lot more immigrants, and will have that effect of people like Farage Reform saying, see, more brown-skinned people, more immigrants, and it will end up helping in a very nasty way to buttress their message. Now, those who are already in the UK, for those immigrants who are already in the UK, it means more people, and it means more opportunities to be demonized.
So again, because, and I'm sorry to cut you off there, Cheta.
No problems.
If we go from the broader theme of the immediate societies or communities that are involved in this conflict, and because we on this podcast we focus on how events in the UK around the world affect the African heritage communities here, I would like us to sort of like bring that back home. Now, if you're looking at, and I think a good place to start will be Sudan, for instance, a country where both Israel and Iran are also engaging in their proxy wars, supporting different factions. Sudan right now, as we know, is
having a civil war.
Is having a mess. And if you look at the numbers, in 2023, over 1,600 Sudanese crossed channels in small boats, which is about 5.6 of the total crossings. That has increased year on year, and it's not yet in 2025. There's a projection that you would have over 6% of the total crossings be Sudanese nationals
migrants,
who are fleeing conflicts in Sudan. And but if you compare that with the the numbers brought in through the
Probably.
UK resettlement schemes, you just have about 165 people. So yeah, if you have over 1,000, almost 2,000 people projected for this year trying to cross the channels, and you have only 165 who have been settled through the official method, that means you have a lot more people
Who would
trying
be
to
legal.
cross, put their lives in danger. Because again, when these conversations about migration are being had, no one looks at the human factors. It's always, oh, look, they're putting pressure on our public services, they are staying in hotels and all that.
Yeah, and forgetting the fact that there will be more pressure on the public service and on the economy as a whole if Iran does what it's natural to it. Because Iran has a major source of leverage in all of this, which is a piece of real estate called the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is at its narrowest point is about 34 kilometers wide, and I think it's about 20% of the world's oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. So basically, if Iran blockades that, then you will have oil prices going up. And not just oil prices. I think it's 20% of the world's oil, 30% of the world's gas that passes through. So for example, the UK buys, I think it's 34% of its gas from Qatar. All Qatari gas has to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. All. So if Iran blockades that, gas prices in the UK will rise. So you will find that energy prices rising will come at the same time as more immigrants are showing up at the doorstep. It's not hard to see how a right-wing party, Reform UK, I'm looking at you, will link the rise in energy prices to more migrants. See, the pie is getting shorter. And let's not forget that every time in history that right-wing parties have risen, it's because the economy has gone bad. The Nazis, for example, just go straight and obey Gordon's law. The Nazis came up as a result of the fact of the Nazis came up shortly after the Great Depression, the collapse of the economy in the Weimar Republic. That led directly, when a loaf of bread began to cost 1 million marks in Germany, that led directly to the Nazis. So that's one of the big fears for us who are basically tenants recently arrived in this part of the world. The fact that the economy seems to be the economy could go bad very quickly, at the same time that because of unrest more people will be looking to leave. Think about all the various groups in the Sahel, and for us from Nigeria, the Sahel is very adjacent. It's part of, in short, a part of our country is in the Sahel. Think of the various armed groups and the fact that, so relate it, for example, with Libya. After Libya, it's not an accident that it was after the collapse of the Gaddafi regime in Libya that Boko Haram, for example, suddenly became a lot better armed, a lot more daring, because there was a lot of huge military reserves, influx of arms that Boko Haram could take advantage of. Iran is more armed than Libya was, one. Number two, there's no group in today's Iran that's in a position to take over governments. So if the regime in Iran collapses, you will have, like you have in Libya, many factions vying for power. So if you have many factions vying for power, one thing that guarantees is that the Strait of Hormuz will permanently be under attack. Permanently. Until one group can bring everybody to heel. So we will be guaranteed a very long civil war. What that means is that oil prices will hit a new mean. If oil prices hit a new mean, a new higher mean, it means energy prices go up. So we already pay. What was the Ofcom energy gap? I think it's about £2,500. I'll have to check. But that will go up. So which means that cost of living in the UK will go up. Again, going up at the same time that more immigrants are showing up on the door.
So does it then, and dear God, I can't believe I'm about to say this, even though I must caveat that what he says is different from what he does. Does it mean that the world should borrow a leaf from Trump's talking point and perhaps J.D. Vance and just stay on their own? Because what politicians will not tell you, as I've mentioned before, is that a lot of what we're seeing, a lot of the channel crossings, a lot of the people landing, or the tenants, as you say, landing on the streets of the UK, you can draw that line to the intervention of the West in the political landscape of other countries. So it's almost not far-fetched to say that if the West stopped intervening in other countries, perhaps there might be some form of stability. that would then let people stay in their countries and build their countries? Should we then do what Trump says he does, but of course we know that he's not doing?
Well, it's a sort of vicious cycle, because the argument can be made that if you allow certain kinds of regimes to just remain untouched, that they would oppress their people to the extent that it ends up creating an arc of instability that will be exported. But at the same time, and this is what the last 20 years shows us, there are certain types of regime that, as distasteful as they appear, it's better to leave them in place, because what comes after is a lot worse. Iraq, we're looking at you. Syria,
Libya,
we're looking at you. Libya, we're looking at you. To an extent, even Egypt. If not for the fact that Egypt gets a huge subsidy from the United States every year, and that's because the United States wants to protect Israel. Were it not for that subsidy, that's a subsidy that neither Syria nor Libya gets, Egypt would have fallen apart. So, for example, and this is a classic example of how a war in one part of the world has an effect. Egypt was absolutely hammered as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war. Why? Egypt imports almost all of its wheat. Bread is a national staple in Egypt. Most of that wheat, the vast majority of that wheat, more than 90%, came from either Russia or Ukraine. As a result of the war, that supply went down significantly. It led to a rise in the price of bread in Egypt. So the Egyptians needed an alternative, and Uncle Sam stepped in. So you see how something happens in one part of the world can have an effect, sort of like a sort of, some people will call it the butterfly effect. So it's pretty much the same thing. I think that, the best outcome for Israel in this war would have been a quick victory. It's one of the reasons why the Israelis went for the decapitation strikes very quickly, to strike at some of the top Iranian military commanders and eliminate them. Unfortunately, what has happened in reality is that Iran has proven resilience. The Israelis were not quite prepared. Just yesterday, the Wall Street Journal reported that the Israelis are running low on interceptor missiles. And one thing that is clear is that Iranian missiles have been getting through to Israeli cities. They have been bombing Israeli cities. So essentially, this war is not something that is going to just end today. It's going to be drawn out, and the Israelis are beginning to cry to Uncle Sam for help. So I think that despite himself, the Americans will help. But the Americans are not going to. One thing I think that the Americans will draw a line at is that they're not going to put boots on the ground. And that's actually a more dangerous outcome for everybody, because you bomb the Ayatollahs out of power, or you bomb Iran to back to the Stone Age. You create the perfect conditions for all sorts of miscreants to take up arms and begin to export their own version of jihadism all over the world.
And the most dangerous sort of war to quell is that fought on idealism.
Yes.
I mean,
let's put it like this. How do you reason with a man who got commanded to kill you?
That is a good question. Now, if we, because I know, Cheta, we wanted to talk about this for a long time. This is the second week we've had to push it away now. But I think there's also a line that can be drawn from this war to the Chancellor's
the spending
review 2 weeks ago. Because even before now, we had spoken about, or rather we had seen, that international aid was reduced in order to buffer up defense spending and all that. And then, of course, Trump came in and is still urging everyone to yet again increase the allocation to defense. And now there's this war. And if, as we've said, wars like this always serve as a precursor to more crossings across the channel. So that means there's going to be a need to buffer up, especially because you have reform knocking on the door, buffer up the border patrol, buffer up trying to either sort out cases that are already here quickly so that people are not moved into hotels. This is going to, again, as you've rightly noted, turn into another campaign that reform will use, and Labour would want to make to show that they are taking immigration and border control seriously. But in doing that and in buffering up those areas, there will be a need for more spending. But as more is being spent there, something has got to give. So do you foresee more cuts to the international aid budget? And even worse, how does that again how does that again translate to what people who are already here trying to make a living for themselves and their families, how does that affect them?
So this is one of those, and thanks for this question. It's actually a very good question. This is one of those things where I would say that all that we wanted to talk about the spending review has gone out the window. So we no longer have to push that topic. It's done. Because if I were a British government advisor, I would actually say that they should review the spending review. At this point, I think that the sensible thing for the British to do is to spend less on conventional defense, because a lot of people may not understand is that a lot of the defense spending in the spending review is geared towards a potential war with Russia. That's not going to happen, at least not in the and yes, I agree that he who must have peace must be prepared for war. But if there is one thing that the Ukraine war has proven, the Russians are not ready for a major war with Europe. And the Russians themselves, the Russians are not stupid. They know this. What the UK should be preparing for now is something more asymmetric, because that's the kind of war that what is left of Iran will fight. So it's something less conventional and more asymmetric, and also counterfactually raising the aid budget, because you need to not just raising the aid budget in itself, because one thing that a lot of countries such as our country prove is that you can pour as much aid money as you want and people will just be somewhere with their cutlery to chop all that money. You need to actually have strengthened systems to ensure that that aid budget is properly utilized. This is important because by creating stronger countries closer to the Iranian problem that can absorb the problem, the issue, you stand a better chance of reducing the flow of refugees. But if you keep cutting aid, those countries, many of them already fragile, it's important to note that along that entire Middle Eastern corridor, Iran is actually the only true nation. Okay, Iran, Turkey are probably the only true nations. Syria, Iraq, Jordan, they are artificial nations that were created by Sykes-Picot, the British and the French, in 1917. So they have all the instability that comes with being artificial nations. And because of that instability, it means that you have to do a lot of work to shore them up. Because instability in the more coherent nations next to them will bring up their own instabilities. There's a reason why when the whole of Iraq went to shit, Iran still managed to stand. But think of your average African conflict. When one country basically goes down in flames, it tends to have a cascading effect, because so many African countries are artificial nations that were created by the stroke of a pen. So again, what needs to happen, in my view, is the aid budget needs to be raised again and properly monitored, so that these countries will be in a better shape to absorb the fallout. The countries in Iran's near abroad will be in a better shape to absorb the fallouts. Also, something that a lot of people are not talking about is what will be the fallout if Israel not necessarily crumbles. The Americans will prop Israel up for a long time. But I think that a lot of, now that the veneer of invincibility that Israel has been thoroughly pierced, Israel will become less attractive. So what happens to that population as well? That's a question that I think scenario planners should begin to ask.
Okay, that's quite interesting. We've covered quite a lot today, and we've gone from the US to Israel to Iran to Sudan to Nigeria. Inevitably, we always happen to find our way there and take a few shots, justified of course, and back home. Cheta, do you have any last words?
My last words are, this could all have been avoided. Unfortunately, in global politics, we've come to a point where personal interests trump the interest of the collective. I think that all of this war is because of Netanyahu's desire to stay in power. I think that many Western politicians no longer look at the general interest of their own people. Instead, they just keep thinking of the next elections, how to look good so that they stay in power. And I think that in many respects, this has been an inadvertent blessing to the Ayatollahs in Iran. They were increasingly unpopular among their people. Protests were rising, and then this external enemy begins to bomb them. It has ended up, ironically, creating a rally around the flag effect. So it's not going to be very pretty for some years to come. I think the next time we'll be discussing the effects of this, of course, our hair will be completely white.
Yeah, and my last thought would be for our politicians here,
You are
on
one of them.
which I am one of them. We need to start speaking plainly about the effects of intervention in other countries. People don't just up get on the boat to try and go to other places because they love the thrill of almost dying in the channel. A lot of times, and this is not to say it's all the time, a lot of times people are fleeing wars and conflicts that have the fingerprints of the countries to which they are
They are
running.
going through.
So,
But
yeah.
so, given that you get into those rooms, I think it's something that you should say. And you've just given me, so I thought that those were my last words, but it's clear that you've given something else to talk about. There's a lot of racism involved in that intervention. A superiority complex. We believe that we can do no wrong, and we have a God-given right to tell others how to run their countries.
Savior complex.
Savior complex. Savior complex ultimately boils down to racism.
Yeah. In fact, remember back in primary school, we're told that it was oh God, what was it again? It wasn't enlightenment. It was but it was along those lines that
For the enlightenment.
it wasn't colonization. No.
No,
First
came to
it was
civilize. It was a civilization
thank
mission.
you. So yeah, it's you're civilizing people while still using their numerals. But that's a conversation for another
day.
another day. But thanks Cheta for doing this as usual, and I'll see you on the next one.
See you on the next one. Thanks. Have a nice weekend.
Yeah, you too, bro.